I get chills just looking at this photo and imagining what happened to these people. This is Changchun, a Chinese metropolis, once home to 500,000 people, under the shadow of reinforced concrete and monumental avenues. This city was built to withstand a war. The boulevards were deliberately wide to allow for armoured manoeuvres and clear lines of fire. Its sewage, power, and telecom systems surpassed many European cities of the era. Modern buildings blended traditional Oriental roofs with massive concrete structures. But in a brief window between May and October of 1948, nearly 330,000 people lost their lives. The city gates were open. There was no attack, no explosions, no street combat, or even a single shot fired. So, what actually happened? Until the mid-19th century, Changchun was just an ordinary town in the heart of Manchuria. It held no real political power and had no military significance. It was a place of peasants, merchants, and local officials. A functional town, but one without a grand identity. Nothing suggested this region would become Asia's greatest economic hub. In 1897, Russia's Tsar Nicholas II met with his finance minister. They needed a route to the Pacific to move troops and supplies, but instead of circling the entire Russian territory to Vladivostok, they struck a deal with China to run the tracks straight through Manchuria. By 1903, the Trans-Manchurian Railway was finally complete, but it only lasted 2 years. After defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, Japan seized control of the southern section of the line. The Russians kept the northern stretch from Harbin towards Siberia, while the Japanese took the southern stretch from Changchun toward the sea. To manage this territory, Japan created the South Manchuria Railway Company, known as Mantetsu. But Mantetsu wasn't just a train company. It had its own army. It operated schools, hospitals, coal mines, and even luxury hotels. The company became the right hand of Japanese imperialism. They weren't just selling tickets, they were selling Japanese imperialism with room service. For Japan, this was a multi-billion-dollar business, but its value went far beyond the balance sheets. The railway was the only way to move coal from Fushun and iron from Anshan, the essential ingredients for the Japanese war machine. However, there was a problem. The railway section seized from Russia used a 5-foot wide gauge, but the trains Japan brought from its home islands in Korea were built for the standard 4-foot, 8.5-inch gauge. Changing the wheels on every train was a complex, costly operation, so they chose to adjust the Russian tracks to Japanese standards instead. In an impressive feat of logistics, Mantetsu realigned the entire railway bed. They literally ripped up the Russian rails and refastened them to the international standard distance. A difference of only 3.5 inches, but it changed the course of history. As a result, everything coming from the Russian north and everything heading to the Japanese south had to stop in Changchun to be unloaded and reloaded onto different trains. Changchun became the largest switching yard in Asia, the natural boundary between Russian influence to the north and Japanese influence to the south. Whoever controlled Changchun controlled the on-off switch of the Asian economy. By forcing this transfer, Japan ensured that nothing passed by unnoticed. Every bag of soybeans, every ton of steel, and every passenger had to step onto ground controlled by the army. It was the most heavily armed customs office in the world, disguised as a train station. This strategic centrality meant that Japan didn't see Changchun as just a station. They saw it as the bedrock of a new empire. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and by 1932, they established the puppet state of Manchukuo. Changchun was the obvious choice for the capital, renamed as Xinjing. With the goal of turning the city into a version of Washington, D.C. on steroids, the Japanese launched an extremely ambitious project. They wanted a showcase of power that would surpass Western standards. The result was an industrial fortress, featuring administrative buildings that looked like bunkers, and a price tag that exceeded the GDP of small nations. A highly efficient capital, and one entirely dependent on its rails. Ironically, that very same efficiency could be brought to a halt with just a few explosions. On August 8, 1945, in the exact window between the two atomic bombs, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. With an overwhelming force of 1.5 million soldiers, they steamrolled through the Japanese defences. In just a few days, the fortress of Manchuria crumbled and Changchun was captured. After a brief occupation, the Soviets began to withdraw, leaving the city in the hands of the nationalists. The scene was one of extreme hypocrisy. On one side, the Soviet officers, burly men in heavy greatcoats, smelling of cheap tobacco, and the confidence of those who had just crushed the Japanese Empire. On the other, General Zheng Donggo, impeccable in his wool uniform, ready to inherit a city that was already a trap. The Russian commander, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, extended a gloved hand in a firm handshake sealed for the cameras. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of the city, the Soviets allowed the Chinese communists to seize the weaponry confiscated from the Japanese. Until that moment, the Chinese Civil War had taken a back seat. Communists and nationalists had formed a fragile alliance, united only by their hatred for the Japanese invader. But now, with Japan's surrender and no common enemy left to fight, that friendship of convenience no longer interested anyone. Both sides understood the same thing. Whoever controlled Manchuria would control the future of China. By early 1948, Changchun was home to nearly 500,000 civilians, along with one of the largest concentrations of nationalist troops in northeast China. The nationalists thought they had inherited a crown jewel, but in reality, they had just stepped into a luxury cage. And the communists were already outside, preparing the lock. The communist general, Lin Biao, was considered brilliant, if not a military genius. In 1955, he would be awarded the rank of Marshal, one of only 10 people in China to ever receive that ultimate title. This placed him at the very top of the country's military pyramid. Lin Biao was elite trained. He graduated from the famous Whampoa Military Academy, where he was a student of none other than Chiang Kai-shek himself. By allowing the nationalists to occupy Changchun, Lin Biao handed them a devastating burden: the obligation to feed 500,000 civilians plus an entire occupation army. With no trains arriving, the nationalists were forced to choose: either let their soldiers starve or let the population die. Either choice would destroy the morale and the reputation of Chiang Kai-shek's government. The People's Liberation Army began occupying villages, intersections, and secondary railway stations, creating an ever-expanding ring of isolation. In May 1948, Lin Biao established a definitive blockade of Changchun. Every grain from the surrounding farms was confiscated to feed the soldiers and ensure that not a single bag of rice entered the city. The goal was to deplete the enemy's supplies until they collapsed. The nationalists converted the wide boulevards designed by the Japanese into airstrips, hoping that food would arrive by plane. Initially, they maintained faith that they could hold out until help arrived or the United States intervened. But every time the nationalists tried to leave Shenyang to rescue Changchun, the communists destroyed the tracks, blew up bridges, and attacked the flanks of the column. The nationalist generals in Shenyang were afraid. They thought that if they sent half their army to save Changchun and they were destroyed on the way, they would lose both cities at once. While the civilians in Changchun starved, the long-awaited nationalist aid remained paralysed to the south. A curfew was imposed in the city from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Anyone who refused to be searched by sentries could be executed. Money lost all value. Formal trade collapsed and was replaced by black market bartering. Objects were traded for small amounts of low-quality food. Gold watches, jewellery, and silk clothes were exchanged for a handful of mouldy soybeans. At its peak, the price of 2 pounds of rice was equivalent to the value of a house. The nationalists attempted to maintain order through rigid rationing, but corruption and despair dictated the rules. Horses were the first victims. Thousands of animals that were supposed to be the army's mobility ended up in cooking pots. Next were the dogs and cats. Finally, people began eating tree bark, roots, horse manure, leather belts, and boiled shoes. When starvation began to take its toll, the nationalists opened the gates for civilians to leave, hoping it would save food for the soldiers. But the communists refused to let them pass. Lin Biao knew that every civilian inside the city was a mouth to feed. If the civilians fled, the KMT army would be able to resist for much longer. Keeping the population trapped was part of a macabre calculation to accelerate the surrender. A no-man's land about 160 feet wide was created between the two armies, filled with barbed wire and landmines. Nearly 150,000 civilians were trapped in this open space between the firing lines, dying in plain sight of everyone. The screams and cries of the civilians could be heard for miles at night, observed through binoculars from both sides. Lin Biao gambled that the horror of seeing their own people starve to death before their eyes would force the nationalist generals to surrender out of guilt. Without a coal supply, people began burning furniture, window frames, books, and public archives. Ironically, the modern architecture of Changchun, built of concrete and steel, was impossible to burn. In old Chinese cities, you could tear down wooden houses for warmth. In Changchun, people froze to death inside modern buildings. Desperate nationalist soldiers began looting the homes of the civilians they were supposed to protect. The few families that had good food stocks saw their supplies confiscated and were expelled from the city to die in the blockade. The moral fabric of the city collapsed under the weight of hunger. A market emerged for adulterated flour made of white clay and sawdust, known as dragon powder. People ate it just to feel their stomachs full, but the material hardened in their intestines, causing agonizing deaths from obstruction. Desperate trades were made in the shadows, where forbidden provisions were sold under false names at staggering costs. A wave of total despair swept through the city, as entire households succumbed to the hollow ache, unable to endure the sight of their youngest fading away. Those who reached their journey's end were left where they fell, as the living no longer had the strength to honour them. Even a thin trail of smoke from a fire was a danger, a signal that would bring the desperate or the armed to your door. The very air was thick with a broken trust that could never be repaired. The great storyteller Shan Tianfang, who witnessed this as a young boy, would later describe a place stripped of its soul, turned into a landscape that no longer resembled a city of the living.
道边上躺着几个人，头一天躺在一个地方，第二天我在那儿路过的时候还躺在那个地方，眼睛瞪得好大好大，脸色还是酱紫色的。那天晚上下了一场中雨，我还惦记路边那几个人上哪儿避雨去。第二天雨停之后，我从那条路上经过，一眼就看见他们几个还躺在原地，不知是谁。
The final collapse of Changchun came from within. The nationalist army, once proud and equipped with the finest American technology, had transformed into a legion of uniformed ghosts. Hunger ignored rank and destroyed discipline. Elite soldiers, who once marched in flawless formation, now abandoned their posts. The chain of command was lost. Orders from Nanjing or General Zheng Dongguo became meaningless noise to men who had not eaten for weeks. Mass desertions soon began. Entire units crossed the lines under the cover of night, surrendering to the communists in exchange for a single bowl of porridge. Political loyalty had been devoured by biological necessity. Even without a single frontal assault from Lin Biao, the city was no longer defensible. American weapons, tanks, and Japanese concrete bunkers became useless monuments. The 60th Army, exhausted and starving, decided they would not die for a lost cause. In an act of revolt against Central Command, they opened the gates and laid down their arms. The organised resistance collapsed like a line of dominoes. Internal betrayal was the final blow that Lin Biao's army had been patiently waiting for. what remained of the nationalist garrison took refuge in the central bank building. Among marble columns and empty vaults, General Zheng Dongguo attempted a final stand. After brief negotiations, they finally gave in. The People's Liberation Army entered Changchun without needing to fire a single cannon. When Lin Biao's troops finally crossed the gates, the scene was one of surreal horror. Inside the military depots, the Liberation Army soldiers found warehouses that still held supplies, while civilians had been dying by the thousands on the sidewalks just outside. After the fall, the history of Changchun was rewritten. The official narrative renamed the event the Peaceful Liberation. The siege was no longer portrayed as a strategy of starvation, but as a brilliant maneuver of psychological pressure. There are no memorials for the civilians who ate the earth in an attempt to survive. No plaques line the monumental avenues to remember the families who froze to death inside those modern buildings. Changchun was rebranded as a glorious victory, and the trauma was swept under the rug of nationalism, transforming the Paris of the East into a symbol of triumph, never of mourning. For decades, the siege remained an absolute taboo. The silence was only broken in 1989 with the book White Snow, Red Blood by Colonel Zhang Zhenglong. For the first time, the truth about the starvation strategy and Lin Biao's responsibility was made public. The book was banned and the author was persecuted. Today, Changchun remains an invisible scar on modern China. The accounts of survivors, like those of Shan Tianfang, are the only fragments of truth left from a time when humanity was sacrificed on the altar of ideology. It is estimated that 330,000 civilians died of hunger and cold during the 5-month siege. Approximately 160,000 of them died between the lines, prevented from returning by the garrison and blocked from leaving by the blockade. The vast majority of the deaths were innocent civilians, not soldiers. To put this in perspective, this is more than double the immediate deaths caused by the Hiroshima bomb, and it surpasses the toll of the Nanjing massacre. The trail of blood was erased by the destruction of civil records and the very decomposition of the bodies, making any subsequent census impossible. The siege of Changchun was not an isolated event, but one of the darkest chapters of hunger as a weapon in the 20th century. Unlike Leningrad, where the enemy was a foreign invader, in Changchun, the famine was imposed by countrymen against their own people. The city became a dangerous moral precedent, proof that biology could be more efficient than ballistics.